All right. Do you want to do the intro or shall I?
I feel like every time I go to do the intro is me messing up the intro.
Okay, there's your little outtake for the beginning, right? Just have that to play the opening music-y thing.
Yeah, boy!
Smile.
Okay, here we go. You ready? Silence!
Welcome back to Exit 181, the podcast where my friend Dean Bianchi,
That's me.
and I, Matt Duncan, talk about music and popular culture, but mostly of a musical persuasion.
No. Or persuasion.
Sure. All right. So today, I think we might be getting a little bit out of our depth, and that's okay because we're willing to be brave and take chances. That's who we are, and that's what we want to bring to all you fine listeners.
All nine of you.
Oh, yes, all 9 of you. Well, hey, it as a time capsule, once this has been around for 2, 3, 5 years, it'll be somewhere around 35 or 40 by then. Yeah. So
I can't wait.
So today we're going to talk about a couple of genres, maybe more than 2. We're not sure, really. That's why we're out of our depth. But we're talking a little bit about synthwave and vaporwave and maybe some other EDM and synth poppy sort of, as I read it, micro genres. And so I suggested that we talk about synthwave, but the whole time I was saying that, I actually intended vaporwave. And so we kind of went down a couple of separate paths and came across some stuff. And it's a wormhole, it's kind of a whole range of stuff, but I think this can be a pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah. Well, when you brought it up, it's a genre that it's not one that jumps in your headspace when, somebody says metal or pop or indie or, anything like that. And you're like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. But it's also, at least for me, one that taking a deeper dive into it, I'm like, oh, I definitely listen to things in all of synthwave, vaporwave, electronic, media, so it'll be interesting to kind of poke through it a bit. And I think there's a piece of it too that because it's a genre that is related to maybe I'm getting ahead of things, it's tied a bit to a time period in some regards, so it has a different thing than just the sound. It actually has some style to it, or I guess maybe that's not the best word. It has some connection to the aesthetics of a time period, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So and here being in the aftermath of sort of I read an article for tonight that is called I better get it right here. So this is an article that was in Esquire, and the title of the article is How Vaporwave Was Created Then Destroyed by the Internet. And this article is from 8 years ago. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of take. One of the other articles I found was called What Happened to Vaporwave. And so the funniest thing is no genre emerges on its own, and so it comes from something else. And the weirdest part of this is that vaporwave is listed in at least one source I found as an evolution of hypnagogic pop. And talk about something that doesn't jump to your mind right away.
Right.
That's one. Now, it also gets connected to chillwave, which I actually have heard more frequently, and then glo-fi and hauntology.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. They're calling out like Witch House and
Yeah, I know you listened to Witch House.
yeah, I went through a pretty big Witch House phase. I still pop it on every once in a while, but yeah, I would have never connected the two in my head. At least, again, not totally connecting to vaporwave as a genre.
Yeah. I don't know that much about these kind of tiny offshoots and little corners of EDM and techno that well. None of it is completely unfamiliar,
Right.
but it's not like I feel completely, linked in or part of any of this scene. But maybe let's sort of set the stage a little bit. Okay, so let's start with Witch House, since you actually got into that fairly heavily for a little while there, right?
Yeah.
So how would you characterize what is Witch House?
So, and I'm trying to even remember what time period we're talking about. So it was probably largely a 2010 to 12, 13 kind of thing. I think there's still some few of those artists that I started listening to still put some stuff out occasionally. But from a musical style, I'm seeing it here in the wiki listing as well. There was like this whole chopped and screwed notion.
Yes,
you see
right.
that term
comes
everywhere.
up. Yeah, absolutely.
So a decent chunk of the Witch House stuff is really in some ways sample based, but mangled in a sense, and it's definitely dark. Like there would be, would have like a pop song or like a sample from a Beyonce song or something of that nature, but it's either slowed way down but then the beat is kind of pushed forward, and it's definitely feels like electronic music in a way, but it's very dark is really the first thing that comes to mind, which, based on anybody who's listening to this for a while. So I tend to get drawn to darker music. And in some ways, I mean dark, just like, a lot of sort of minor tones and stuff. It's not necessarily evil, although I think one of the bigger artists that have put out a lot of stuff and still do stuff that I see, and I don't know if I can exactly pronounce it right. I think it's Matter Suspira Vision. Look them up real quick.
Yeah, I don't know.
So what they do, well, and I think, yeah, Suspira is and I might be pronouncing that wrong, is based on, that's a old Italian horror
okay.
movie.
Suspiria.
Suspiria.
Yeah. Suspiria is the, that's a Giallo film by Dario Argento.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And they have a ton of stuff out, but especially at the time when I was kind of deep diving into it, a lot of it, and I guess this makes sense why it's connected to this vaporwave and synthwave and kind of the direction I'm sure we'll bring up, is a lot of the visuals were very like witch occult, Satanism,
Twin Peaks
kind of stuff.
Blair Witch.
A lot of Twin Peaks, yeah, and then there's definitely a huge, which I think that attracted to me a lot. There's a huge Twin Peaks kind of connection where there is even an album of cover songs, or not cover songs, but songs by these artists that were in this genre doing different takes off of some of the Twin Peaks kind of music, and
Oh, cool.
again, sort of chopping and screwing it up and so I think it connected or it resonated with me on multiple levels. So again, like, I like sort of the minor and dark and things that have a kind of a really strongly connected mood. We had the whole episode on Frisson and stuff, and there's something to that piece. The visuals were just kind of cool, and they connect with, obviously, huge. I'm a huge David Lynch fan, and Twin Peaks holds a special place. So that sort of aesthetic, and then the technical part, the actual act of kind of a lot of sampling, but like really just taking it. So it's not sampling like, 'cause hey, this beat is cool, and then I'm gonna put a different melody over it or something. Like it's not sampling like Paul's Boutique or any kind of hip hop
right.
sample. It's
Right,
not.
right.
It's very much mangling it almost beyond recognition, but not totally beyond recognition. And then a lot of times it's slowed down. So, and just the act of slowing down a pop song and drawing it out, and it creates a creepy sort of
Right.
sensibility, So the name Witch House is very weird, but also completely fits. It's
Okay, sure. Yeah, so there's some interesting parts to that. Okay, so just in the briefly looking at this, so DJ Screw was a guy. He passed away in 2000, but he's a hip hop DJ from Houston who started just chopping up and screwing up or messing with older pop songs, and so that's kind of where that got its start. And then you mentioned our first song episode where we talked about how shoegaze is kind of a part of that, and then there's this there's this whole collection of stuff, a lot of it being like bands that were on the label 4AD in the 80s, so like Clocktoe Twins and Dead Can Dance and stuff like that, which I guess has now been recategorized as ethereal wave. So I had never heard that term until like, I don't know, 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
That gets kind of subsumed into goth and dark wave and things like that. But with that as kind of a backdrop or a baseline for sort of the aesthetic or the tone or mood that they're going for, and then stuff like Black Tape for a Blue Girl, This Mortal Coil, all of those kind of bands, taking that and applying it to this chopped and screwed kind of thing. It's interesting that he went with Witch House, going back to kind of, you mentioned David Lynch and Twin Peaks, but another theme kind of with us and our friend group from college is H.P. Lovecraft. And one of his stories is, oh my gosh, what is it? Ghost in the Witch House? What is the name of that? One moment. I gotta look that up.
I am not very fluent in the H.P. Lovecraft stuff. I mean, I've heard about it many, many times, but I've never actually...
Dreams in the Witch House, sorry.
Okay.
So Dreams in the Witch House is an H.P. Lovecraft story. And Dreams in the Witch House features like a humanoid rat called Brown Jenkin, and it's got... Lovecraft was from Providence, Rhode Island, and so kind of the history of that region with the witch trials and Salem and all that kind of thing sort of influenced him somewhat, but he was never going to be just somebody who told scary stories about witches and ghosts. He wanted it to be weird as an end goal, and so it's a pretty weird story.
As a side note, Salem is the name of one of the bands that was pretty big in this
and
genre.
That totally fits, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so apparently, did you ever listen to Picture Plane?
Yeah.
Okay, so Picture Plane, I guess that guy is the
guy
one who coined the term witch house, and they were making a joke, and it stuck.
Yeah.
And he mentioned it in a Pitchfork magazine article, and as soon as it ends up someplace big, you can't do anything about it.
Right.
I mean, I think about all the industrial bands who complain about that term, and then finally they just kind of said, "Yep, that's us." They stopped fighting that, and I'm sure the new metal guys all kind of,
right.
Well, that's not what we are, or we're not like Limp Bizkit, or any of that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
Okay, so from Witch House, you eventually like keep evolving, and then you get to these other styles. So I'll start with Vaporwave because it seems a little older in some ways than Synthwave. And I think it's a little more close in its origins to like this whole chopped and screwed thing.
Yeah.
So it's listed as a micro genre, and it is apparently, an evolution in the early 2010s of hypnagogic pop. So what is that? Well, that's like a psychedelic subgenre, and it's about nostalgia for the 80s. It's very lo-fi. It's got retro aesthetics that sort of throw back to the 80s. And what Vaporwave seems to do is try to be a cultural commentary on just how capitalistic the 80s were, and the way that you can sort of repackage the past and sell it. Like, in a way, it's kind of celebrating and, I don't know, almost like well, yeah, it kind of goes both ways. Like, it's critiquing the fact that the 80s were as just completely vapidly consumerist as they were, and yet turning it into this art form that people like really like, and that whole nostalgic feeling is a celebration of all that stuff too. So Vaporwave is very weirdly like this sort of mix of stuff like old Macintosh computers and the video game Echo the Dolphin. Features heavily in a lot of the stuff that happens with Vaporwave. There's a guy named James Ferraro and another guy, Daniel, I think it's probably Lapotin. I think he's French. But he goes by Chuck Person. And then there's a woman, Ramona Xavier, who originally put out what is arguably the first Vaporwave album, but as her recording name was Macintosh Plus, and that album's called Floral Shop, spelled SHOPPE. So these like three big guns of Vaporwave are these three people. Ramona Xavier is still doing stuff, but is more commonly known as Vectroid, VEKTROID. And a lot of these people record as like half a dozen different, band names or whatever. Yeah. Like they change their identity whenever they put something else out. The Chuck Person album Echo Jams, and that's ECCO, like the dolphin in the video game. Echo Jams Volume 1 is in 2010. James Ferraro put out Farside Virtual in 2011. Floral Shop came out in 2011. And the genre continues the whole chopped and screwed thing, but layers in what, to me, like, as I was listening to playlists, a lot of it sounds like the transition background ambient music in, like, 80s B movies or like Cinemax softcore pornography. Yeah. It's just this kind of synthesizer-y. You feel like you're watching a videotape from 1984. Very much so. Whenever you listen to any of the stuff.
Well, and I wonder, diving into that a little more, because I know we briefly talked about it the other day. It's so like some of these artists you just mentioned, do you know, are they like in their 20s and 30s, or are they like,
like how old are these people?
Yeah, like because
okay.
I think a little piece of this, and I don't know if this is the exact moment for it, but like there's definitely something to these things that play into that 80s nostalgia that clearly have to be different to you and I who lived through that. I mean, all your examples you just gave would not be examples that someone who is 30 now would even know.
Right. What you're and so like about. James Ferraro is 37 years old. Vectroid is 31, and Daniel Lapotin is 41. So he's the French. No, he's American. He's Chuck Person. So he seems to be the oldest, and that puts him at like 10, 11 years younger than me, and about, 14, 15 years younger than you.
Yeah.
So he's the same age as my younger brother, who probably remembers some of the stuff because he's my younger brother, right? Like, he's 9.5 years younger than me, so he experienced
Yeah, I just
some of this in a
figure
different
somebody
way.
who's 30 doesn't have the experience of you're up at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night and you're flipping through the random cable channels because there is no streaming and all that stuff, and you're catching some of these movies. And
I just realized I may be saying that guy's name wrong. I think it's Lopatin. Lopatin? I don't know. Anyway, I spelled it wrong. I typoed his name when I put it in my notes. So, apologies to Chuck Person. But
we'll just go with Chuck Person.
yeah, there you go. That's what he wanted, right?
Unless he pronounces that.
Well, so the other
Parasol
thing is he goes more frequently by 10 Tricks Point Never, or OPN. And he won a soundtrack award at the Cannes Film Festival for this. He scores films. So in 2017 he scored Good Time, and in 2019 he scored Uncut Gems. Now, isn't that the Adam Sandler?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this Chuck Persons guy, he scored that film. So, there's some of these people are kind of making it now,
Right.
which is good for them. Like, that's pretty cool. And so it turns out also that Ramona Xavier is actually Ramona Langley. So getting, like all of these different names, there's a lot of identity stuff here. And I think that's kind of a big deal here. Yeah, so even some of the names of the stuff, like, Vectroid originally was Macintosh Plus, and another, thing that name that she worked under was New Dreams Limited. But there's just a ton of them. Tanning Salon. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different names that this person has gone by.
I wonder if as I'm kind of skimming this stuff too, I wonder if some of that is just representative of that time. You're in that middle ground between the internet is commonplace,
right?
But the internet isn't yet on our phones and on every device and on our washing machine,
right?
And
yeah,
you know what I mean. Like it's still, it's not a brand new world, but it's definitely not fully flushed and fully explored.
Right.
I'm seeing a lot of citing of popularity on Tumblr, popularity on here. Like, it's the beginning of those sort of platforms that are just people connecting with each other and talking and sharing stuff. We've brought that up a few times already about, I mean, this is the beginnings of that sort of thing where you can suddenly have 97 million subgenres of everything. And
right.
that wasn't a thing in the 70s.
Yeah, right. The rise of the smartphone is happening contemporaneously with this. Like the first iPhone is 2007, and so by 2010 it's like more common that most people have ditched their Blackberries.
Right.
And their flip phones and are, making that jump over. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this subgenre, that, especially stuff by Vectroid in the various incarnations, that's Japanese too. Like, the 11th album by Vectroid, but under the name Virtual Information Desk, is called Sapporo Contemporary, which is contemporary Sapporo. Oh, sorry, not 11th, 10th, the 10th studio album. And like, there's the label that it came out on is Beer on the Rug. Like, even these record labels seem like they're one-off things and little publishing sort of niche things.
But I think there's something there too, like even just what you're saying, like, you're at this is the time period where you can first easily find obscure music from Japan or be influenced by some strange thing from Spain or, like
right.
prior to that, I think a lot of the music we've been talking about in some regard was, especially like when the main genres, the metal and the rock and that stuff, like you can easily just sit and trace that stuff back. This is kind of our first foray into, subgenres that are connected to subgenres from because some guy was on Reddit and got linked to a thing from another country of some weird, like this is where you're starting to see that sort of weird, somewhat harder to trace, at least, connection between all these things.
Yeah.
And even seeing they're listing on all these, like, these different connected genres, but then you've got, so I'm on the Vaporwave on the wiki page, and like, you mentioned some of these things, but it also cites origins in elevator music and pop ballads and smooth jazz and
well, and that's the thing. Okay, so this is where, like, as things kind of as we keep talking about vaporwave, there's two things that we really need to talk about, and some of it is exactly what you just said. Like, a lot of it is music, a lot of it is elevator music, literally, but it's like synth based elevator music. It's not music that would have been at the forefront of anything. It's not music that people were going to be like buying singles of to like have it chart. This is stuff that is meant to be in the background, stuff that's meant to set a certain tone. I even think about like sort of goofy chase scenes in episodes of Moonlighting. That's what a lot of this sort of feels like, especially the early seasons of that show. Or movies like Chopping Mall, or there's stuff like that where, and the music is not like, we talked about soundtracks, and this is not curated popular music. This is paying some session musician to crank out stuff on their couple of keyboards, kind of stuff. But it also harkens back to some of the music that like John Carpenter was doing for his own films, like the theme song to Halloween, or some of the pieces of the soundtrack to The Thing. That synth-based, mood-inducing kind of stuff from like 81 to 83. Very much part of the stuff I was listening to.
Well, and I would have to imagine that's part of the key. I mean, circling back a bit to where we started talking about, where like Witch House for me, but all of these genres that we're talking about, where they work for me, I guess, in some regard, but I maybe don't necessarily know all the artists' thing, because they are a background music that invokes a mood. So there's, even if to tie it to the Frisson thing and stuff, it's definitely, you're not listening to it because the lyrics are awesome and the chorus is cool or the guitar riff was neat. It's a totally different kind of experience. I think there's that added layer again, like I said, like, because we lived through what some of this genre is paying homage to. So there's clearly, it brings you back, it gives you that feeling of watching a chase scene in Moonlighting, or the first time you saw The Thing, so it doesn't need, go ahead.
You go ahead, finish your thought.
I was just gonna say, so it in some ways it's a listening experience that doesn't need the cool second verse that pops into the chorus, and these aren't those type of, it's not that type of thing. It is much closer to a Muzak, it's background music, but there's those other factors pique your interest, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. Maybe not everyone's interest, but I'm still kind of fascinated by someone not having lived through that, because but making this music, like, where is that coming from in a different, I guess it would be if you and I decided to, we're going to get in a recording studio and make a bunch of songs from the 40s.
Yeah.
We just are trying to mess around with it, but do it a little different or something. But it wouldn't have that piece of like, I remember this from when I was, 18.
Right. Well, I sometimes think that maybe like the the continued wave upon wave of resurgence of ska is maybe a little bit like that. Like the original ska stuff was in the 50s in Jamaica, and then you get all these British guys in the 60s and 70s kind of, picking up on that, and then more British guys in the 80s, and then a bunch of California kids in the 90s. That seems a little bit like that. But the big difference here too is like this is often one person with electronic tools, like computers and synthesizers, almost like throwing back to a previous era where the synthesizers were less sophisticated, using really, really high-tech equipment to sort of emulate or do a pastiche or an homage to this older stuff. The other thing, like soundtracky kind of thing that I'm reminded of a lot is Tangerine Dream.
Okay.
And I think, is it Tangerine Dream who did the soundtrack to Blade Runner?
Maybe.
Vangelis. It's Vangelis.
Wow.
Okay.
They
Not
also
Tangerine
did
Dream.
Chariots of Fire is what I always think of.
Yeah.
Vangelis.
No, Vangelis. That opening kind of scene where the flying car goes past the big headquarters. Vangelis is a Greek guy.
So I don't think I have seen that movie since I was a teenager.
You should watch it.
But it's funny about that. So I'm still trying to kind of mentally connect the dots between someone who's 20 years younger than us and this stuff. But so then that's Blade Runner might be the perfect example of where there might be a connector because, as much as we talk about music and stuff, I think we also had a strong connection to obscure movies and different things.
Right.
So, we could have totally, we had like, I don't know. I remember like seeing Tetsuo the Iron Man or something like.
Right.
There could be these obscure or Dogs in Space for me. Like,
right.
That was a movie that is not in popular culture in America in any context whatsoever. But we found a videotape and got all sucked in. So totally somebody 30 years younger or 20 years younger could have saw Blade Runner on cable one time or their friend was like, "You got to see this movie," and
right.
we get all
right.
So I guess I'm.
Well, yeah, like
presumptuous that you have to have lived through.
But there is a difference. Like, I remember Blade Runner coming out and not seeing it, right? Like, because I was like 10 or 11 or something. And then I got to college and Nick, who we've talked about before, my roommate, he had a copy of it. So we watched it and then it got re-released and re-edited and like the voiceover, like the hard-boiled detective thing got taken out of it. And it was released on 70 millimeter. And so it was in theaters again in like 1991 or something. And so that became like this touch point of like, oh, wow. Yeah. That movie is, almost 10 years old, but I'm experiencing it for the first time. And then you look at, the sequel comes out, 40 years later or whatever, 35 years later. Yeah, like, I don't know how old, what's his name? Ryan, the guy who was Ken in the Barbie movie.
Gosling.
Ryan Gosling, yeah. I don't know how old Ryan Gosling is, but I think he's younger than me, and he's starring in that, like, there's this nostalgia thing kind of leaks over into the other generations. Yeah. And then you get things like video games. We've talked a little bit about the way, for a while there, the way some younger generations were experiencing music that we actually grew up with would have been through video games like Rock Band or whatever, but also Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah.
And Grand Theft Auto has actually some shared aesthetics with Vaporwave because that whole Miami Vice kind of vibe is part of this. The all the neon pink and the gradient deep blue. And a lot of it. One other place that I did not realize until today, I was giving a or I guess it was yesterday, I was giving my students a chance to do like a game to review for a test, and I made a Jeopardy grid for them. And I went and I found a template online that did it in Google's Slides. And I didn't realize that the Jeopardy logo for a very long time was this gradient of deep blue fading into a lighter blue into neon magenta on top of a crisscrossing grid.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the vibe too. And Jeopardy's still on TV going strong all these years later. And so, there's a lot of this sensibility to the visuals and also to the sound that is just kind of baked into a time, and it's immediately evocative.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes this subgenre, anyway, the vaporwave subgenre, kind of important and interesting, is that it is trying to evoke something from roughly the middle of the 80s.
Yeah. No, and that's I think that's where I kind of want to. I'm backpedaling a little bit on my sort of maybe tone that I had before. Like there's a part of me that I feel like I was heading down a road of like this sort of not full on pretentiousness, but like because we lived through it, and so therefore there's some extra layer that we're privy to that I'm like confused of why someone else will get it, but that's kind of ridiculous.
Well,
because also like a lot of the stuff I'm into is not anything that's related to what I lived through. So it's
sure. Well, I think some of it is maybe even the fact that we take it for granted and don't value it. It's not. So, okay, you think about in the 80s and the Stray Cats. The Stray Cats were way into like 50s style, and that whole greaser kind of image from stuff like Grease and Happy Days and whatever else. And so there's always that kind of nostalgia for the past that's about 20 to 25 years out, but those guys, I don't know how old Brian Setzer is, but I would guess that he was a child at best in the 50s. Right. He was born probably sometime around like between 1950 and 1955. I'm just throwing that out there as a guess. But the Stray Cats did not deviate from that look and feel and scene. That was their shtick, And then
you're right.
You get like all of the Fish fans who basically are aping the Grateful Dead, hippies in the 90s. Yeah, well, Sha Na Na is a good. Yeah, there's another example. Like all through the 70s, the 50s were romanticized, and then in the 90s, you still get a bunch of like wannabe hippies. Like hippies in the 90s, what the hell is that even about, right? But we knew plenty of them in Bowling Green. There were a lot of hippies out there on the quad kicking the hacky sack around, and that's interesting. It's strange.
So maybe part of what's interesting to me then is along those lines. So all those examples were also big in pop culture.
Yeah.
Whereas this stuff we're talking about is not. Like it's a nod to parts of, so yes, it fits in that same idea that you're talking about, this sort of 25 years later romanticizing a past. Only Sha Na Na is doing something that was also popular, and these Stray Cats are doing it whereas this stuff we're talking about is picking up on nuances and aesthetics and feelings from the past that aren't necessarily, they're not just like flat out playing the Miami Vice theme and sounding like Duran Duran. Like that's not what is going on. It's so in a way that makes it more interesting.
Yes.
I guess that it's
I agree.
A unique take on.
Well, so this is okay. So So to riff off of where you've gone with that, because I definitely see where you're going, and yeah, I think you're touching on it, because there were bands in the aughts who wanted to sound like bands from the 80s. Like we talked a little bit about Kill Hannah sounding kind of like Jesus and Mary Chain or Echo and the Bunnymen or something a little bit. There definitely was sort of that throwbacky kind of let's channel that 80s alt rock, progressive alternative, whatever you want to call it, kind of sound. But the interesting thing here is leaning into and sampling, or even recreating a broken version of the 80s. And you see that aesthetic in some other places too, like the number of people who will make YouTube videos with faux VHS counters and the tracking off and a little tracking meter come up, and that's not something, or like when people will use sort of the glitchy record hiss skip sound on their tracks when they're writing their own electronic music or any kind of music. They layer that stuff. There's all of that sort of glitchy aesthetic and grunge aesthetic kind of stuff that was happening in the early days of the internet, right at the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s. The almost more authentic feel you would get from something if it looked screwed up or broken or vintage or just not quite right. Because it's more like it came off of a VHS tape. It was almost a reaction against the perfectly pristine digital nature of stuff.
Well, and there's probably something there which also meshes with kind of, or in conjunction with, a lot of the visual stuff playing off of what the 80s thought the future was gonna,
right.
The way that the 80s portrayed 10 years ago now.
Right.
The way the 80s portrayed 2010 is very different than 2010 actually was. But then these things are playing into that sort of, it's got this futuristic feel, only it's not futuristic at all. It's what the, 40 years ago thought the future was going to be.
Right. Yeah. Blade Runner's set in 2019.
Yeah.
And, right. We don't have flying cars and androids.
Right.
Nobody's living on Mars.
There's something to that which is very different than a 1950s movie that's portraying the future in 1980. Like, I'm trying to think of what, there was some movie that, I don't know. But, like a lot of those 50s cheesy movies that might be about the future and space, and they're so far off as well, but it's a different feeling. Like there was something to the way the 80s portrayed, again going back to your neons and your that color palette and grids and initial Atari like graphics and or old CRT computer.
Battlestar Galactica's high tech computers.
Yeah.
And there was now, and that's another thing to think about too. I didn't even think about that connection, but the fact that the Battlestar Galactica TV series came out in like 79 or something like that, like right after Star Wars, and then an entirely new version reboot of it comes out in the early aughts that was incredibly popular and incredibly successful and played with some of the goofiness, the way they explained why their computers were so low tech and why they didn't have all this high end stuff, even though they were, flying spaceships, is because they wanted to keep the Cylons from hacking them. There's just a lot of like smart stuff that they did to play up sort of the brokenness of the future predictions.
Well, and there's something there, and this is could easily derail us off on a tangent, but I was thinking about that in this, as you think about, the ridiculousness that people in the 50s thought the 80s or 2000s were going to be is based largely on, your imagination and how fast technology is advancing while you're alive. Then you get to the 80s was sort of the first little bit of like, suddenly there's VCRs and there's...
A computer doesn't take up a room or a warehouse.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the first touch point, I think, culturally of...
You can own a movie in your home.
kind of envision a little bit of like, hey, these things... They were still way off base for the most part, but...
Right.
And so now... And who knows, we may, 30 years from now, you'll look back at something that was released now that was envisioning life 30 years from now, and it still may be way off. But I bet it's a little closer,
right?
Because we've now experienced, 5, 10, 15 years of exponential growth of technology. So the Battlestar Galactica example, to me, is a really good one, where it's not surprising that the writers have the smarts to figure in those things or factor in those things. Like I was listening to something earlier where they were referencing the original Battlestar Galactica, and they're like, why didn't they just dump water on the Cylons and they would shore it out?
Right.
But now you can envision but then the newer one is like the Cylons they look human and but they are still built. Culture can handle that mental leap of. There could be a being that looks exactly like a human, but is based on something, whereas in the 50s, you couldn't, you had a robot going, wallpaper,
right.
That was
right.
the extent your imagination could
take
it. Anyway, so I don't want to totally derail where we were going, but I think
but
there's something to the 80s that was the first where culture could handle a little bit of future thinking, but they were kind of still a bit goofy about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So vaporwave is therefore in some ways like in on its own joke. It's critiquing. It's satirical in some ways. It's an homage that also pokes at what was going on. There's some kind of commentary happening. It's somewhat self-aware. And a lot of the stuff I listen to, if there are vocals, they are samples. They are commercials. They're Japanese. They're not the artist singing into a microphone. There's something from somewhere else, and that's where you get back to that whole chopped and screwed kind of stuff.
Right.
But a lot of it's instrumental, and like that whole Muzaki, cheaply produced background music for a television series kind of vibe. The opening sort of for a production company, some kind of bum 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 bum, and then you see a logo come up and it's all like video toaster level graphics that was like such a big deal throughout the 80s. That's very much a part of vaporwave and the critique it's making on sort of that commercialism and that consumerism.
Well, that whole aesthetic in the 80s was taking itself so seriously.
Seriously.
Bringing it, but it is clear, like just by bringing it back and putting that front and center in and of itself is this slight mockery, yet it's a bit of a like, oh my God, how silly was that kind of a.
Well, yeah. And so that's something that I think a really interesting piece that I don't think comes up maybe as often as it could is right there near the end of the 80s, Max Headroom was a thing. And there you've got like one of the first sort of really fully realized digitally created characters. And it started out just being this goofy thing on commercials and MTV and whatever. And what is this guy? And
commercial or something.
Yeah. And why is what is it even about? And then that gets turned into an actually pretty insightful, biting social commentary TV program about the nature of a mediated world and journalism when everything is online. It wasn't, that wasn't the term we used then, but when you can watch what somebody sees and does all the time, and when there's a virtual version of a person floating around somewhere. I mean, that show was kind of ahead of its time, and it took this goofy ad concept and turned it into something that was then critiquing itself.
Yeah.
And so the way that Max Headroom, glitches and stutters and repeats sounds and that kind of thing. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that kind of comes back around in the vaporwave sensibility.
Yeah.
So switching gears then, because I screwed up and told you synthwave instead of vaporwave, I was kind of surprised once. I was like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I was talking about. When we got the synthwave and some of the things that we were discussing and the bands that we were looking at, is a very different musical vibe, even though some of the visual sensibilities were the same. That kind of throwback neon over faux metallic kind of display font stuff. That's in the same vibe. There's a lot less sort of old anime cartooniness and vintage computer stuff involved, but there's still some
there's
similar.
less sampling, like the sampling and pulling, trying to mix in a little modern bits merged into, like, it's definitely more flat out synth in some ways. And
they're writing songs.
Yeah. And it's on one level it's the same thing. It's an homage and it's a throwback and it's a whatever, but the commentary isn't there. It's more of a tribute to some degree, like not a flat out like this is the greatest time period in music and blah blah blah. But they're definitely taking it serious. It's taking you back to that time period in a completely different way. Not in the, like I said before, not in the like, hey, look how silly this was, but kind of like, hey, look how cool this was. Or, maybe not cool isn't the right word, but, like, I'm just looking here too. Like, so the bigger artists are the ones that they're calling out. Like, so that Kavinsky is one. And then actually in here is College. Oh, and Electric Youth. That's a good album too. There's like, so that I had heard more synthwave than vapor, or at least initially probably recognized a few more out of that. And they are more sort of serious songs, but they do a lot of nods to the same kind of soundtrack vibes. This is still calling out John Carpenter, calls out Goblin, like that kind of Italian 70s. But like, so it's a lot of the parts are the same, yet there is enough of a difference to call it a different genre, but there is actually it's coming from a pretty different, I think it's just different in its intention, at least. Exactly. Like the goals are different. The point of it is different. These are I don't want to diminish or lessen like the artistry of Vectroid or Check Persons or any of those people, but I think what they're trying to accomplish and what they're looking to do is not as solely I want to make songs to sell to people. I think it's more like I want to do an homage, I want to do a critique, I want to remake something, I want to break this thing and put it back together my own way. That seems a lot more like an explicit, overt goal of vaporwave. Yeah.
And for synthwave, it's like, I want to be in a band. I want to write music. I want to make songs that people buy and listen to and maybe dance to. And if any of the rest of that maybe, happens as far as a critique or an homage or whatever, great. But there's an aesthetic that is aesthetic, pure and simple, that they're like riffing off of and tapping into and doing their homages to, but it's for the purpose of making new popular music as opposed to some kind of commentary.
Yeah. Which, it is what's probably most interesting about it, because you could just grab 3 songs from each genre and just playing them to the average person, they may not even sound different to some degree, but
right. Or I think there's even a possibility that you could play that kind of cross section of stuff, and they're like, well, these don't have anything to do with each other. They don't even sound similar. And you and I would be like, oh yeah, they do. Listen to that.
Yeah. I mean, some of it is flat out in what the music is made out of.
Right.
Like again, the synthwave, you completely take out the chopped and screwed bit, the sample bit, take all that out. Yeah, the synthwave is definitely more influenced by soundtracks and video games and less about the overall 80s aesthetic dynamic. It's a little more honed in on that piece of the 80s, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the aesthetics are still the same, but that's because that's what the 80s were. Like, you still got some of the VHS feel. But even looking at, even like on the Wikipedia thing, so the origins, it's a far shorter list of origins. It's a...
Right.
And the related subgenres are then very different, and that's, I think, where it diverges away. Like, because to your point, like these synthwave starts connecting to other genres that are making music genres versus mucking around with the technology and type of genres. And maybe one piece section, just now that I'm looking at it, I wonder if there's something to the fact that they're so, even going back to Witch House, but I think it still connects with Vaporwave and stuff. There's that sort of hip hop or rap piece. Like, it's so very, very loosely tied, but there's some little connection to that type of music that I don't think synthwave and going in that other direction has that same. Even like on the surface, if you had to say which genre is more dancey, I mean, Vaporwave would be more, it's, I think synthwave is more, gets a little more ethereal, a little more.
Yeah. Look,
I mean, it's still got beats and it's still a thing, but.
Right. Well, and I think, like, synthwave seems to be pulling more from other musical genres as opposed to zeitgeisty cultural genres. Yeah. Like, it's looking to evoke things similar to like other bands. Like we started out talking about like those 4AD bands like This Mortal Coil and Cocteau Twins and Dead Can Dance and things like that. Interesting connection, ironically. The 2011 movie Drive, starring Ryan Gosling, has who is the android cop in the sequel to Blade Runner, and so he drives his flying car a lot in that movie. In Drive, he's a getaway driver, so he's driving a car a lot in the movie. But the soundtrack to that film is very, very synthwave. And then there's the soundtrack also around the same time to the film Tron Legacy, 2010. And there you've got yet again a much later sequel to an 80s film that imagined a future that or something related to technology in the future that very much has nothing to do with how things actually turned out in the future. but leaned hard into that sort of synth wavy genre and aesthetic in the soundtrack. And that's a really cool soundtrack, actually. Like
I'll
there's
have to
a lot
check it
of
out.
good
I
stuff.
don't know that I've actually listened to that one. So I think what you're saying is, and based on the last episode as well, where that there's some Ryan Gosling thread that we're gonna start to discover.
Yeah,
that's
I
gonna
mean,
connect all the dots between all of the stuff we listen to.
He may have taken over from Terry Lasher as our executive producer because everything's about him instead of her. Yeah, we haven't mentioned Terry in several episodes. We've dropped the ball on that.
I know. And we do eventually have to figure out getting a guest on this show.
Yeah.
I mean, this is number 9. Maybe, before we get to 20, we should.
Well, I don't know if we have that long. 20 episodes.
I've got a sign now.
It's like 5 years from now. But
no, we've been on a roll.
Yeah, we have. I
think we've doubled our episode count in the last 6 weeks than the whole first year.
We put out what 6 or 7 episodes in the first 9 months, and an equal amount in the next 3 months. I started getting all my notifications on Facebook that 1 year ago, here's a memory, and it's us posting the first episodes. It's been a year since we posted, the original kind of our sort of origin story for our musical taste or whatever. Yeah. Daft Punk did the score for that Tron movie.
Okay.
And there's a lot of great stuff on that. It's actually pretty cool. It's worth a listen. But yeah, so there is that whole nostalgia thing where we constantly want to look back and, relive some of that excitement of youth. I mean, even look at Stranger Things and the way that that's actually a pretty good, like the opening sequence to Stranger Things and the music that's used there is very much kind of in that vein of what Vaporwave seem to be trying to capture. Synthwave just, I think, tries to be more serious about that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring that because as I'm skimming not that everything is Wikipedia is the be-all, end-all, but under Synthwave, they call out Stranger Things a couple times under Synthwave. Yeah. But I think actually, based on even what we've been talking about, that somewhat makes sense in the context of Stranger Things is not a story about the 80s, but they take being set in the 80s very seriously in the way that the Synthwave music is kind of taking that style seriously and making music. Like Stranger Things is clearly the 80s is a strong it's literally a character of that show.
Right.
Not in a I'm poking fun at the 80s. I mean, they make a few nods that are humorous, but it's not really making fun of the 80s. It's not getting into the politics of the 80s. It's not getting into the capitalism of the 80s. It's just about living in the 80s. What was being a teenager in the 80s. So
yeah, and they try to do their best to sort of make it authentic to that time and not pretty it up too much. The number of people like smoking and the sexism and the closeted kids are still closeted, and the nerds get beat up and are not running corporations.
it's a pretty accurate take on that time period without, I think that's a good way to, without prettying it up. It's not glorifying anything, but it's not hiding anything, but it's also really not commenting on anything. It just is Like you're just watching it and you're like, it just is the 80s. Like
Yeah. It
it's not
doesn't.
trying to point out that this was bad or this was good or the you know.
Yeah.
I think there are some things out there that are set in the 80s and they leverage that as a way to comment on, like you said, capitalism or the politics of the day or whatever,
Right. Yeah. There's not like, I don't think it makes the 80s look all that pretty.
No.
It's pretty, it's fairly realistically like crappy.
Minus the Earth opening up in a hole and the
right.
That. That's but yeah, no.
Yeah. Well, so all right. So you said that there were a handful of these synthwave bands that you actually kind of listened to with.
Well, and we
some
may have
regularity.
determined that they may not exactly.
Well, you mentioned Kavinsky and college, right?
I have listened to Kavinsky in college. And maybe I was, in my head, I've always connected college with Chromatics and Glass Candy and some of these other bands that I'm seeing are really considered more just electronic music.
Okay.
Which, that could be a whole nother episode, is just like, are too many subgenres too much, or should we have a subgenre for everything? But then you could literally, you could take certain albums that we've listened to and every single song is a different genre, and what do you do with that? And then, so.
Right. So I don't know if you ever saw this, but back in the early aughts, there was a website. I wish I could remember the name of the guy that built it.
Spiderwebbed all the.
Yeah, that showed all of the electronic subgenres.
I think it had everything. I still have it bookmarked. Let me find it.
Yeah, dude, that thing was amazing. But holy crap, the amount of work that had to go into it. And by the time that guy finished it, it had to be out of date. It had a sample from like just about everything. And it was...
Yeah. What the hell was that called?
Was it... Okay, here's a question. Was it built in like Shockwave or...
It had some
Flash
in that.
Yeah, was it a Flash site and therefore it's like completely not functional anymore?
So yeah, all these bookmarks are. I'm getting sorry, we can't find that site. But I just thought of that the other day. Every Noise at Once.
Oh.
It's maybe this isn't the one you were thinking of.
Yeah, I don't know if that is. I'll look it up.
If you go to everynoise.com, like every noise, one word.
Everynoise.com.
It's got
okay. This is similar, but it's not the one I was thinking of.
But like just
there's
a bazillion
holy
genres,
smoke,
and then if you click on a genre, I think you can start to connect. So if you click the little arrow next to it, not the word, because the word will play music.
Okay. Then it gives you a breakdown of a smaller...
A breakdown of all these artists, but then I think from that artist, you can click their arrow, and then it actually just goes to their page. So it's not... there. I think the other thing I was thinking of that, it had all the like stuff spiderweb together, kind of, where you could... But this is similar, at least in the fact that you could like find like... the number of genres on here is ridiculous. I'm scrolling and I'm seeing hundreds of Brazilian metalcore.
Yeah. Ishkur's Guide to Electronic Music. That's the one I'm thinking of. ISHKUR.
Because this one is like everything.
Yeah, Ishkur's Guide to Electronic Music is music. Oh wow, he redid it. Oh. Okay. Wow. Yeah, he's redone this whole thing. Okay, yeah, so it's music.ishkur.com. Music.ishkur.com. Yeah, that thing is nuts, and it is set up like it's across the top. There's KUR, and it used to be, I believe, a Flash site. And
Okay.
you can like zoom into this thing now. Yeah, he's redone the whole thing. That's crazy.
Well, we got our cut out for us if we're gonna cover.
Cover any, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's
that-
just plan to do an episode on every genre that exists, and then
Yeah.
which one of us dies first, and
Right.
we won't even be a tenth of the way done.
Right. Well, it's oh, and this is cool. On that site, you can like scroll. Your scroll wheel will move it in and out,
Yeah.
and then it's set up by timeline. Looks like he stopped adding new genres sometime around 2005. but still, like, just an amazing resource. Anybody who has any kind of interest in the history of electronic music. You know, it's.
I think between both these websites, because then the other one, just if you just
Yeah.
want to be overwhelmed by every possible music genre that.
Yeah, that thing's crazy. Wow. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so those kind of websites I think are doing a lot of hard work because, like you said, there's just so many subgenres, so much Japanese heavy metal.
Here's Russian witch house, Chinese metalcore, Belgian new wave, Mapuka. I don't even know what that is.
Yeah, right.
Zitsanga pop, Granada soca, featuring artists like Talpre and Slada and Temptress. So anyway, I don't know what any of those things are. And who knows? Maybe.
Well,
my
okay,
new favorite
so
band.
Kavinsky. So if we go back to Kavinsky, you know, this is a 48-year-old French guy who is a DJ, and then in 2012 and 2013 gets his start, and then eventually gets involved with like video game music, like Gran Turismo and Grand Theft Auto and things like that. Tours with Daft Punk. But interesting, Kavinsky is like a character. It's not like the guy's name is Vincent Belorget, I think.
But all his album art and all that stuff is all in that vein. It's like it looks like 80s computer generated.
Yeah.
Dude standing near a car, like a cool looking car.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's some. I alluded to this a little bit, but a lot of that stuff is very obviously similar to graphics that were generated by video toasters.
Yeah.
You know, which was the default graphics generator, computer graphics generator for TV and movies even for a while there, and very obviously had a distinct offered or contributed a distinct vibe to the way things looked in the 80s. What was the computer platform the video toasters were based on? Is it a Tandy? God, what was that?
Amiga?
Amiga, yes.
Is that it?
Yeah, yes, it's Amiga. Yeah.
That was a little bit of a shot in the dark, but I was thinking of old computer systems.
Yeah, the New Tech Video Toaster. But yeah, they were Amiga 2000s. So, did you ever use one when you were doing your radio, television, film degree?
At Bowling Green, when we did I forget what it was, one of the RTVF classes where they had the news room kind of set up. There was a couple cameras, and then they had you would put the graphics over it, and it had a super old timey, whatchamacallit, not closed caption. What's the teleprompter?
Oh, yeah.
But I never used it to do much more than play with that a little bit.
So, interesting stuff there with that. I didn't realize it was released so late, but video toasters didn't come out until 1990. So by the time you were doing stuff with it, it wasn't that. It was pretty new, but
or it might not have been it might have been something a little more primitive.
I
remember something where you typed in a title and a thing, and it would show.
I bet it was that. It's just that was the limits of what you could you could do. But Amiga was a computer made by Commodore. And so Commodore, loses out. They just keep losing market share as Windows and Macintosh grow in popularity. But the interesting thing, like what started as the video toaster eventually evolved into the TriCaster, and those are still being made, and like those use Windows now, but it's interesting that's where that got its origins, because TriCasters are still used in like all kinds of studio and even live on site kind of TV production stuff. So that's really fascinating. And Lightwave 3D is it survived the death of the video toaster. The software platform became, early 3D imaging and effects. That's pretty cool. There's a lot of interesting stuff, but it's very much of the time that, there's that look that absolutely screams this is not, modern 3-dimensional video production. Are there any other bands that, as far as synthwave groups that stand out to you or that you want to mention? You talked about College a little bit.
Yeah, I think College is the one that and I think so. I hadn't thought of it until now when I saw the name scrolling through some of this Electric Youth, which I think only has one album, and I don't know if it's related to if it's getting its name from the Debbie Gibson song or but
or is that actually Debbie Gibson album?
Sorry, I guess. But yeah, it's so let me pull them up real quick. Yeah,
I've got that pulled up because they were connected to
created and associated. So A Real Hero is this the first song.
Right.
Was prominently featured in the movie Drive.
Right.
The song. Okay, so
and they did not name themselves after Electric Youth, the 1989 album by pop singer Debbie Gibson.
Yeah.
And that so here's an explicit kind of resistance to what we've been talking about, this whole nostalgia thing. So there's a quotation here from Austin Garrick, who is the producer, songwriter, does synths and drums, says, "The thought of recreating the past with music is not interesting to us. It's probably been the biggest misconception of our music and what we're about thus far. The reality is we're much more interested in creating things for the future than things from the past. We are not nostalgic people, not in the sense that we long for a different time because we love the present. But how could we not be reminded of the past when every day we see the person we had a crush on since 7th grade?" I don't know what to do with that entirely.
Well, but in some regards, that answers maybe a little bit of some of the things we've been talking about in that. So does it say how old this dude is? Well, regardless, he's clearly not. I mean, what he's saying is that they're not trying to sound like. Well, they're not trying to. Yeah, I guess recreate. There's clearly influence. I don't know. That is a weird statement in that regard because
they've been.
I mean, their music doesn't
couple.
sound. I haven't listened to it in a little while. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't remember thinking like, "Oh, this sounds like it was written in the '80s." As much as it sounds like it's in this same vein of these other things that are giving a nod to the 80s. So maybe in some ways it's not more than a nod to the 80s. Like,
yeah. Well, and it looks like one of their albums had production work by Vince Clarke from Erasure and Yaz and Depeche Mode, and that's big. That's pretty interesting and pretty cool. That guy Austin Garrick is also known as Watts and has produced Ghostface Killah, Redman, Method Man, but also like Ryuichi Sakamoto. Weird. That's just really really interesting. So there's definitely a wide range of things going on for these artists. The synthwave ish band that I have the most familiarity with is Carpenter Brut, and he's French. His real name is Franck Hueso, and I mean that's very dark wave, dark synth, almost industrial at times. The name of the band is sort of he says it's another joke. I think that kind of sort of jokiness in the naming of these things, that then just the joke gets lost and it's just who the bands are, is kind of common, it seems. But the Carpenter in the name is a reference to John Carpenter, who we talked about before. But there's also a champagne brand that has a very similar name. But like this guy says he was inspired by Judas Priest and like other glam rock in the 80s too. So, there is that kind of nostalgic piece, but it's not what you think. It's very different. It's a very different kind of thing.
Well, yeah, looking at this list of influences, I mean, there's something to, you throw all those things in a blender. I don't know why not? Isn't this what comes out? Yeah, because it's
right.
Metallica, Megadeth, and then like movies like Creepshow and Friday the 13th. But then you got Nine Inch Nails in here. You got Pink Floyd. You got I mean it's,
and also Toto and Supertramp.
Yeah. So I guess in a way to maybe, because maybe at some point we probably need to slowly wrap up.
Yeah.
But I think it reminds me of something that came up. I'm trying to remember which episode it was that we touched on it a little bit. But I think this is another example of potentially there is something to, as we keep moving forward and the people making, let's just say art across the board, but in our case, particularly music and newer music, the pool of influences musically, culturally, everything has blown up. Even I'll call back to what I was saying earlier, where like, we grew up with this, there's a nostalgia feeling because I remember catching The Thing on cable when I was whatever age, and you felt what you felt for those movies or those TV shows and stuff. But now you have a generation past of people that are as easily exposed and influenced by that as they are by a Britney Spears video 20 years later and a whatever this and whatever,
right.
And so like the pool of things to influence them to create their own art is so much bigger than ours was, which was so much bigger than somebody 20 years before us, which, so I think through these conversations that may be a recurring theme, especially around things that are newer.
Yeah.
In the music and art space.
I totally see that too, and I agree. One of the things that struck me about the 90s is that, like, I started college at Bowling Green in 1990, in the fall of 90, and I walked in kind of having just sort of discovered all these bands that I was like, oh my God, where has this been my whole life? What's going on with this? What's happening? I went to my first concerts in 1990. I saw the Violent Femmes and the Dead Milkmen and Nine Inch Nails and Meat Beat Manifesto, and then I saw Skinny Puppy once I got to school, and it changed stuff for me as far as music and my experiences and the things I wanted to do and wanted to see and wanted to buy and wanted to listen to. But by 95, grunge happens there in the early 90s. Glam metal and all that kind of stuff kind of takes a dive and disappears, and nobody really sort of recovers for the rest of the decade from, what had been huge in the 80s, just kind of going by the wayside. But so many weird genres kind of also bubble up. Alt rock becomes anything we can find. There's that whole weird toying with swing And you know, like there's Zoot Suit Riot, and there's all of the Cherry Papa Daddies and Squirrel Nut Zippers and all of that kind of stuff. No doubt, kind of takes the ska punk thing into the mainstream for a little bit there. Everything kind of comes together by the end of the 90s, and it's hard to tell what is going on. And then new metal happens. And then country music goes bananas and becomes the most popular. Like, country music became pop. Like, pop music was just there was some pop, there was some R&B. It was still doing well, but country music just started selling like crazy. And then the aughts come around, and it's not anything goes, and we're signing anybody who sounds like a weirdo and dresses funny. It was very different then. And I just remember being completely floored meeting somebody in like 2001, 2002 who was, fresh out of high school, and one day would be wearing like black eyeliner and black lipstick and having spiky hair and wearing fishnets and, ripped up denim and whatever. And the next day would be wearing like a cute little skirt and, high heels and have pink fingernails. Like, and that it was just like something you could put on.
Yeah.
And that all of those things, that person might be just as willing to listen to like candy raver techno as Britney Spears. And no big deal, just because I like it all. And this is what, all these genres are available to me all the time because of Napster or, iTunes or whatever. So I can pick and choose. It seems like where we are now and what you alluded to just a little bit ago is very tied to the fact that you don't have to have your identity tied to the music that you choose, in the way that I very much felt like, if I'm going to not be a poser and listen to this music, or if I'm going to not be a poser and wear these combat boots and have this purple hair,
right,
there's something else happening socially that has absolutely changed in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, or it is just that music isn't what makes that connection or bond between the people of maybe the way it did.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, to be honest, I don't know, because I have no insight into it, but, somebody who just was indifferent to music or just liked what was on the radio, like that wouldn't, and their group of friends were the same way, that music wouldn't be the thing that pulled them together. I mean, I think there's the flip side of what you're talking about may be the fact that we actually all bonded over these bands and music, and that was an important piece. And so it's hard to picture not,
Right.
But I think that may be as much a symptom of the times as it is a symptom of that was just happened to be a key component in most of the friendships that I had between
absolutely
15 and 30, like, I don't know. That also could be a thing for a whole nother episode.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'd like us to look into maybe in a future episode too, I went to see DJ Shadow like 2 weeks ago, and it was a good show. It was cool. And like the opening act was this young guy from Brazil, and he's in his like early to mid 20s maybe. But holy crap, everybody at that show was at least 30. And I keep noticing that at a lot of these shows that I go to, that like occasionally you'll see some young folks here and there, but it's not like the whole crowd is a bunch of young people at the shows I'm choosing to go to.
Yeah.
It's and there's a whole lot of 40 somethings just, and older at all of these shows. And so it makes me wonder sometimes, like, well, where is the, quote unquote scene, and is there one, and has that fragmentation of kind of the community surrounding music fractured to the point where it doesn't even make sense the way I think about an alternative scene, a punk rock scene. Is that just not the same, or am I just not going to the right places on the right nights?
I would bet it's all of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're certainly not going to easily find out about what small club you should be going to on a Tuesday to catch whatever. But I also don't know that I could easily see that there isn't that same sort of underground scene. Like what? I mean, based on what we're talking about and all these things and all the access across all this stuff to everybody, what is underground anymore?
Right. Or do you have to go to a place? No, you can just get on Discord or some other some streaming thing, and if it's on Twitch, that's better because I don't have to, put pants on,
Well, and that's so I wonder. I mean, I guess again, I think this is actually just fodder for another longer conversation. But to that point, again, I think whether it was just us and the people we were around and the people we associated with, and there was what you listened to carried weight.
Yeah.
In some way, and it was even how you navigated that, because there was, we had people in and out of friend groups that were like, people would try to leverage, like, and I'll fully admit I was, a bit snooty and snotty about some of the things I listened to, and I probably still have a little bit of that. You start talking about country music, I'm gonna shudder inside and not give it a fair shake, but whatever. But but I also wonder again, like nowadays, is that you can't just walk around going, I listen to Ministry, I listen to this, I listen to whatever, and somebody's gonna go, oh cool. Like, I mean, maybe nobody cares what anybody listens to anymore. It's not so flat out like that, but I mean it certainly clearly doesn't define your belief system or your politics or
that's for sure,
who you are as a person, like where, and maybe it really didn't when we were in college either, but we felt like it did a bit.
Or we sure wanted it to.
We wore it as a badge, kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely, we wore it as a badge for sure, and there are times when I still do, I mean, there's a reason like 3/4 of my wardrobe is black t-shirts, Yeah. I just can afford more black t-shirts now.
Yeah. Well, and so it still may carry weight among all of the rest of us between 45 and 55, but I guess to your point of where the young people are or whatever kind of a thing, like that music may not be the thing that's connecting those
it's
dots and groups and
it's definitely also like a lot of the iconography of what we were looking at has become fashion branding. Like the Misfits, I couldn't tell you how many albums they've put out in the last 20 years. I thought a couple of them that they put out 20 years ago were great. 25 years ago, there was some really great Misfits albums that were awesome. And, the stuff they were doing at the beginning of their career is great as a punk rock kind of touchstone. But what the Misfits is right now, I mean, I know they still tour and whatever, but they are a clothing brand that is based in distribution via Hot Topic. And there are tons of kids who buy Misfits t-shirts because it's a cool looking t-shirt at Hot Topic. Yeah. And that's okay, because it keeps those cats in money in ways that their CDs, records, and tapes aren't anymore. So good for them. You go, Doyle. Like you deserve a paycheck. Great. But like, you go to any Target or especially Kohl's, and like all these nostalgia t-shirts cheaply made, selling for like $9 a pop at most, sometimes $5 a pop. They're all over the place. And it's, Def Leppard and Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin and, all these bands. And then you watch some K-pop videos from the last, say, 5 to 7 years, and you've got these 17-year-old Korean girls wearing Kiss and Guns N' Roses t-shirts.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're listening to Kiss or Guns N' Roses, but who cares? That's not the point. The point is that iconography now, says something. And the t-shirt's probably a $300 major brand that happened to have licensed a screen print from Iron Maiden. There's just weird stuff like that too. There's that ironic sort of fashion sensibility. I don't know. Nothing means anything anymore, Dean.
Yeah. It was fun while it lasted.
Yeah. And it's not really all that clear that it meant anything before anyway. All right. Well, I don't know if we gave anybody any insight into synthwave or vaporwave or any kind of wave, but
I mean, mostly everybody's up to date on Ryan Gosling. And
yes, but at the very least, we found a new theme and a new executive producer. So, Mr. Gosling, have your people contact our people, and we'll make the connection.
We got to get people then.
Well, yes. Well, I think my people are you, and your people are me. And so, as long as he calls one of us, we'll get him on here. I hope to God within the next 3 years, we get to the point where Ryan Gosling is like, "Oh yeah, I'll be on your podcast." That would be awesome. Mark my words. We should make a wager or something. We'll see what happens. He seems like a very friendly guy when I watch his episodes of Graham Norton. He's on Graham Norton a lot, and he's funny. He's a Canadian, We talk about Canadians a lot on our show here.
We do.
Well, so we want to thank everybody for listening to yet another rambly episode of Exit 181. If you're interested in more, you should check out our website at exit181.chaosspirals.com. That's chaospirals.com. If you are on Facebook, you can check us out there. We have a Facebook group, Exit 181 Podcast. We usually cross-post this on Spotify and on YouTube, so you can find our channels in both of those places. We would encourage you to join in the conversation in any of those places. Start a conversation even, because, we're still trying to get things rolling on that front, and we want to interact with people and see what you're thinking about what we have to say. If you think that we are completely off base, that's an even better reason to tell us what you think and point us in the right direction of cool things. If you have any ideas about topics you'd like to hear us talk about, all 9 of you, hey, if each one of you comes up with one, we're set through the summer, right? So let us know. And with that, I'm Matt Duncan.
I'm Dean Bianchi.
And this has been Exit 181. Thanks and good night.